Rubrics, Part 2. In Part 1, we looked at the basics. What is a rubric? What are criteria, descriptors, points on a scale, analytic versus holistic, and the virtues of analytic when dealing with complex performance such as our competencies. In this part, we look more closely at criteria. Remember the two-question test. Where should we look, and what should we look for? Well, the criteria answer the question of where should we look. In other words, what parts of performance matter most? But you can't just pick any old criteria. There are criteria for the criteria. So let's think about the criteria that make the most sense if we want valid rubrics. So let me propose 4 criteria by which we can examine assessment criteria to determine whether they're the right ones. The first criterion is valid. The criteria have to be valid. They have to make sense in terms of what the performance is, to make sure we're looking at the right things and not trivial, inappropriate, or arbitrary ones. They have to be independent from one another. We have to make sure that what we're assessing and giving feedback on is distinct, separate, not unwittingly overlapping or redundant. Thirdly, we have to make sure that the whole set is appropriate. We want to make sure that even though we chose one by one criteria that make sense, we want to make sure that the set makes sense and that they are appropriately weighted toward the point of performance. And finally, we want the set to be efficient. There has to be a small, manageable number of criteria, or we'll just be overwhelmed. So let's go a little deeper on each of the 4 criteria for criteria. Our first criterion is valid. We need to make sure that we're assessing against the key elements of genuinely successful performance. We need to know where to look to make sure that we're looking in the right place, not just the easy-to-look place. It's a common failure of many rubrics to just count what's easy to count and score what's easy to score and differentiate higher versus lower score in terms of more of something or less of something. But we're talking about complex performance, and we're talking about qualitative differences that determine whether or not a performance was highly successful or less successful. So we have to be mindful. It's not about what's easy to count. It's about what are the most logical, performance-derived criteria for distinguishing levels of success. Valid criteria correlate with genuine competency. Invalid criteria may sound plausible or concrete, but are not correlated with genuine competency. Let's take one of our competencies to make this abstraction a little bit more concrete. Let's think about the criteria for assessing performance in the competency of communication. What is characteristic of successful communication? Well, here's a set of possibilities. The person clearly states a position. They address the purpose of the communication, the audience for the communication. They use some helpful visuals, and they respond helpfully and informatively to questions and concerns raised by the presentation in the audience. On the other hand, consider the following. We wouldn't want to assess the quality of the communication in terms of whether or not it was funny. Because whether or not it was funny is not central to the communication competency. It might be not funny, but highly informative and appropriate for audience and purpose and all the rest. Nor in a piece of writing should we make it a criterion that a persuasive piece of writing has to have 5 paragraphs. That's an arbitrary structure and an arbitrary number. It doesn't matter that we use that simplistic scaffold to teach it. It would be unwise to make it a criterion for any piece of communication that's meant to be persuasive. Similarly, we don't want to say you have to use PowerPoint. Rather, it's more important to make sure that there's some helpful visuals. Using PowerPoint or not may not make a difference. In fact, many PowerPoints don't help the presentation. And as we mentioned, you don't want to just count things. We shouldn't say that the communication has to have 3 different resources or types of resources to support claims. We see this a lot on teacher rubrics. It's not about the number of resources. It's whether they're appropriate. It's whether they help build the case. Again, it's qualitative, not quantitative. We can generalize from this example and do what we call the 2-question test for validity. You'll recall we had a similar 2-question test for the performance task. Now we have the same test for the proposed criteria when assessing performance. Could the proposed criteria be met, but the performance still not end up being successful? Could the proposed criteria not be met, but performance end up successful in terms of the actual results? The challenge is to answer no to both. So use this practical tool when thinking about your own rubrics, your own criteria, even your own grading and scoring system. It works pretty well. Our second criterion for good criteria is independence. We need criteria that are independent of one another so that there's no overlap or duplication. Here's an example. Suppose we're assessing the student's paper, and we say we want the content of that paper to be accurate. So we're going to look at accuracy of content. We also want to look at the writing as it unfolds. And so we want to consider the criterion well-developed. So how well-developed is the writing? How accurate is the content of the writing? Are they independent? Well, it seems so, but let's use a variant of our 2-question test. Can a paper have accurate content but be a poorly developed paper? Yeah. Can a paper have inaccurate content but be well developed? It would seem so. And so, since we get yeses from both questions, we say the criteria are independent, one from the other. And that's what we want, to make sure that we're not unwittingly scoring the same thing in different words or having confusing overlap in the criteria. Let's try another pair. Can a paper be well developed but not thorough? How about the other way around? Can a paper be poorly developed but very thorough? That doesn't sound right. It sounds like development and thoroughness are pretty closely related. They may not be the same, but they're certainly so related that we need to further clarify what are we really getting at, and are there distinct criteria here? Are we using different words for the same criterion? And if they're not quite the same thing, how can we rephrase it so that we really have distinct elements for scoring? So, for instance, we might say, well-developed and well-organized and logical and well-sequenced, if that's what we mean. That doesn't necessarily mean it's a thorough treatment of the content. Those do seem independent of one another. And so that's the kind of thinking and back and forth that we'll have to engage in. Our third criterion for good criteria is appropriate, an appropriate set. Okay, we came up with what we thought were individual criteria that were each valid, and they're independent of one another. But when we look at the set, does it seem like the right set of criteria for that competency or that performance? And is it weighted as it should be toward the bottom line, what we call the impact of performance? We tend to overemphasize content, process, mechanical, organizational criteria in scoring student work. We tend to underemphasize or even ignore the impact criteria. What do we mean by impact? Well, the result, the effect, the bottom line. Was the point of performance honored and accomplished? It's useful, therefore, to think not only of individual criteria, but types of criteria. And so let's stick with this distinction between impact, process, and content, and follow it through with some examples. The desired impact is clear enough when telling a joke. Was it funny to the audience? Did they laugh? Doesn't matter how funny you think it is. Did they laugh? In terms of process, was the joke told well? Comedians have to have good timing. Was it told well with good timing? And given the setting and the audience, was the joke's subject matter appropriate? Maybe they didn't laugh because it was inappropriate for that audience. But look at it the other way around. The content could be appropriate. The process of telling the joke could be perfect. You could have told it well with great timing and good diction and clarity, and they still might not have laughed. And that's the desired impact, and that's what we want to focus performance assessment on. Yes, it's true. For feedback's sake, we want you to get the content-related feedback and the process-related feedback because they may have been the source of your difficulty. But we want to make sure that impact is the more heavily weighted consideration on the part of the performer. Here are some examples from the academic realm. And again, we've put them in the form of questions to give you a sense of what the judge should be considering, but also what the performer should be considering in self-assessment as a vehicle for self-adjustment. Hopefully here, too, you see the importance of focusing on the impact criteria. Again, the content and the process could have been wonderful, but if the desired impact was not achieved, we need to report that out and even to highlight it in our assessment. Again, if we can get the student to internalize these questions and to really think through in self-assessment and during performance, then this is going to make a difference. The student is going to gain greater control over the performance, and indeed, highly competent people do this. They ask the right questions and follow them through as part of becoming excellent performers. Our fourth criterion for good criteria is that we need an efficient set. It could be an appropriate set. The criteria could all be valid and independent, but there's just too many of them. it would be not feasible for the assessor, and it would be overwhelming for the performer. And so we have to make choices. We have to make compromises. And we try to make the best compromise we can. We want efficiency, but we also don't want to sacrifice validity and useful feedback to the student. So to see how this might work, let's take a simple example. We brainstorm some possible criteria for a good meal. Well, it has to be nutritious, that's for sure, especially in this health-conscious age. But on the other hand, we want it to be tasty. Well, it's got to be well cooked. Just so, al dente, à point, well prepared. But we have different people eating. And so we need to be sensitive to their tastes, their needs, their dietary restrictions. But it also has to be appropriate for the occasion. We can't serve a highly formal meal at a picnic, and we can't serve snacks at a Thanksgiving dinner. Well, but it also has to be feasible. I mean, for the average person, we have to be able to make it in an hour or less. And there has to be sufficient variety that it's not bland and boring, mindful of the fact that there are different interests and styles and tastes. And we want it to be heart healthy. And it should be well presented at table. And well, you get the idea. There's always an infinite number of criteria for any complex performance. And so we'll brainstorm, we'll come up with a good long list, but then we'll pare it down to an appropriate, feasible set of criteria, as in these three: tasty, appropriate, well-made. You might have made a different choice. You might have said nutritious, tasty, well-presented. It doesn't matter, as long as we're comfortable that the three criteria do a good job of balancing efficiency with effectiveness. It's what we call the Goldilocks problem. Not too many, not too few, just right. So we have our criteria. We're good to go. But why not just use the criteria by themselves then? Doesn't that give us all we need to know? Well, no. Go back to our discussion of accuracy and thoroughness and add two more criteria for assessing historical performance in writing. Let's say that the paper has to be accurate, thorough, polished, and persuasive, with persuasive being our impact criterion that we'll give the most points to. Isn't that enough? Well, yes and no. Yes, if you know what all those words mean and you know exactly what the judge is looking for. And indeed, at the highest levels of performance, that may be true. But no, if those words are supposedly self-evident, because they're not. I don't know what you mean by thorough if you've never judged my work, or if I haven't had my work judged a lot. I don't know what you mean by persuasive. Does that mean I have to change people's mind? Or is it sufficient to make a good argument in terms of having a lot of evidence and good logic, whether or not I change anybody's mind? So the criteria, while necessary, are not sufficient to tell me exactly what you're looking for. I need more detail. I need look-fors. And I need you to avoid just vague comparative or evaluative language like good, excellent, poor, which just finesses the whole question. If you say the paper has to be highly polished and the weak papers are not very polished, you haven't told me anything about what polished means. And yet lots of rubrics make this mistake. This leads to what, for some people, is a counterintuitive idea, that in fact the rubrics depend on samples of work. The samples of work come first, not the rubrics. We look at actual samples of work that are polished or not so polished, and we say, that's definitely polished. Well, that one's not. Well, then why did I say that? In other words, analyzing samples and turning them into descriptors is how we go from just the criteria to having full-blown rubrics. So the process goes something like this. We look at samples of work, and we think about our criteria, and we sort the work into piles along a continuum of excellence. So suppose we're looking for persuasive writing, and so we see that some papers are more persuasive than others, and we sort them into piles. And gradually some generalities emerge as we look at each pile and how it differs from the other piles. That's the beginnings of our full-blown rubric. We basically will describe in general terms what each pile has in common. Or to say it a different way, we generalize explicitly from what we did sort of intuitively and by observation and minimal reflection to make the initial sort. So we turn those piles into some generalizations, and those generalizations become the draft descriptors of the rubric. Now, if you don't have any samples for the particular thing being assessed, say in this case any of our competencies, well, nonetheless, you probably have access to student work or other kinds of work that relates to what is being assessed. And we can, for the sake of coming up with helpful descriptive language for the rubric, look at those alternative samples. It doesn't matter that the task or the project was slightly different, or that the focus wasn't only the competency or mostly the competency that we care about. As long as we have some samples to get some rich language from, that puts us in good stead. Well, what if you have no samples? What if you can't fall back on any concrete anchors or examples of related work in question? Well, then you just have to do the best you can from memory. And here it's helpful to come up with concrete examples from memory. So instead of just saying, what do competent communicators do that incompetent communicators do not do, for example, it's actually helpful to think of particular examples of competent communicators that we all know and think about, or maybe even find, now that we're clearer on this, some YouTube videos or samples of work that we can use as models, as anchors. And lo and behold, we begin to get some descriptors that certainly would have to be checked out after the fact to make sure that we're on the right track. But 9 times out of 10, we're off to a good start. We've got some valid descriptors in the making from that exercise, under the assumption that we've had personal experience with the competency in question. As suggested by the example, it's really important to start with samples of excellence. And that may mean going outside of school right from the start. We're not giving grades here. We're trying to understand excellence and design backward from it. We're trying to identify the criteria and indicators, the look-fors that are true of competent performance at the criteria that we're interested in. And so, since we're not giving grades against an impossible standard, rather we're just trying to understand the standard, it's actually very useful and informative for students as well as teachers to look at samples of true excellence in deriving an assessment system. So we always start at the top, and we start with the most competent performances at the competency that we have interest in. we build out the top level, and we build out the bottom level. In this case, the bottom level means not competent. You could call it the cut score. We need to be really clear on what excellence is, and we need to be clear on what barely not competent is, so that we can justify our later judgments in the assessment. Then we can fill in the details of other levels as we go, without yet committing ourselves to a final rubric. We might have 4 points, we might have 5, we might have 6, we might have 8. That's a later decision. But we can fill in the middle to get us going. It's not helpful in our experience to just have one big pile in the middle. It's useful to start with a 4-point scale for building a sample rubric, because it forces you to make the right choices. It's a rule of thumb in measurement to not use an odd-numbered scoring scale, because people are prone to just dumping everything into that middle score out of laziness more than out of astute judgment. It's just tempting to go to that middle point. So a 4-point or a 6-point rubric is probably the norm in measurement. Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this section. We talked about criteria for criteria, and we identified 4 useful ones: valid, independent, appropriately weighted, and efficient. We also talked about deriving rubrics from samples and building piles of work, sorting them into piles of quality, making generalizations about each pile, and using that as the basis for the descriptor of the rubric. And we talked about starting with true exemplars of what it is we're seeking to assess. In later sessions, we'll talk about building out the rest of the rubric, refining it, validating it. But with these tips, you're in a great position to build out some helpful, rich rubrics that you can use right away in the fall.